On the morning of April 27th, 1980, federal agents in Nassau County played a wire recording for a man they had just arrested on narcotics trafficking charges. The voices on the recording belonged to James Burke and Paul Vario, the two men who had defined every consequential decision in the arrested man's adult life. On the recording, Burke was telling Vario that the man they had arrested needed to be killed. He was out on bail within days. Burke called him and proposed a trip to Florida, a job that needed handling, work Burke thought the man would be useful on. The man had never been asked to kill for the organization before. He understood exactly what was being proposed. He did not get on the plane. On May 27th, 1980, Henry Hill signed a cooperation agreement with federal prosecutors that ended 25 years of organizational loyalty with the same precision he had applied to every other calculation in his life. The calculation was identical to every previous one: survival above everything else. The difference was only in the means. Where survival had previously required extortion, robbery, and a narcotics operation running from Brooklyn to Pittsburgh, it now required testimony. 50 convictions followed. The men who had trusted him spent the remainder of their lives in federal custody. The man's name was Henry Hill, and the story of what he built and what he dismantled and what happened to him in the decades that followed is one of the most precise demonstrations of organized crime's central fiction. That the loyalty binding such organizations together is anything other than a mutual agreement enforced through consequences. When the consequences shifted in favor of cooperation, Hill cooperated. Then he spent the next quarter century proving that the government's capacity to change his name was no match for his capacity to remain exactly who he had always been. Drop a comment below letting us know where you are watching from. That information genuinely makes this worth doing. If you are new here and would like more history like this delivered directly to you, please subscribe before we go back to the early 1950s, a cab stand in Brooklyn, and the 11-year-old boy watching from across the street who had already decided what he was going to be. To understand what Henry Hill chose on that May morning in 1980, you have to begin approximately 30 years earlier in a neighborhood in Brooklyn where the distance between legitimate life and organized crime was measured not in moral terms, but in geography. The Hill family occupied a household in the Brownsville section of East New York, Brooklyn, one of the working-class immigrant neighborhoods that New York had accumulated through the first decades of the 20th century. Henry Hill Sr. worked as an electrician. Carmela Costa Hill had come from Sicily. They raised 9 children in conditions that were not impoverished in the extreme sense, but that offered nothing which would encourage their occupants to expect much from the institutions around them. Henry Jr. was born on June 11th, 1943, and from early childhood his most consistent view was not of the interior of his family's apartment, but of what stood directly across the street. Directly across the street was the cab stand operated by Paul Vario. Vario was a capo regime in the Lucchese crime family, one of the 5 families that had divided New York City's organized criminal operations among themselves with a thoroughness that would have impressed any legitimate corporation. The cab stand presented just enough plausibility to justify its existence and conducted almost nothing legitimate through that existence. Vario's men used it as a gathering point for planning and execution, hijacking at the airport and the piers, loan sharking through the neighborhood, gambling, extortion, and whatever other opportunity the surrounding geography presented. Vario had been born on July 10th, 1914, and by the time Hill was old enough to understand what he was looking at, Vario had spent decades building a crew that was productive, disciplined, and well insulated from the attention that had destroyed less careful operations. What Hill saw from across the street was not, in the context of East New York in the 1950s, an obvious threat. It was a demonstration of what was available to people who understood how the actual economy of the neighborhood functioned. The men across that street wore better clothes than his father. They drove better cars. When they walked into a restaurant, they were seated without waiting. In a neighborhood where an electrician's income represented the visible ceiling of legitimate ambition, the cab stand was a working tutorial in an entirely different set of rules. He began crossing that street at approximately age 11, in 1954. He ran errands. He fetched coffee. He delivered messages and parked cars and did whatever small task was placed in front of him. The work itself was not remarkable. What was remarkable was the education it constituted, because the organization, for a boy willing to pay close attention, taught precisely the things that legitimate institutions never addressed: how authority is established, how money flows and who it flows toward, what reliability earns, and what the alternative to reliability costs. He was receiving an apprenticeship in a trade with very specific entrance requirements, and he was absorbing those requirements faster than most. Paul Vario noticed. He had spent his adult life evaluating people for the specific qualities his organization required, and he could identify those qualities in preliminary form with the confidence of someone who had been doing it for decades. Hill showed up every morning. He did what he was told. He asked no unnecessary questions. He understood without instruction that the nature of this work required silence as a condition of continued employment. Vario began paying him. Hill began understanding what he was worth to the organization, which was the beginning of understanding what the organization was worth to him. The first formal test came at approximately age 16. He had been running a small operation selling untaxed cigarettes to factory workers, a business connected to the crew's broader interests in goods that moved without government involvement. An arrest resulted. A lawyer connected to the organization arrived before the legal situation could develop into anything consequential. Prosecutors questioned Hill. He said nothing useful to them. The crew celebrated this refusal. Vario and the men around him understood that reliability was most meaningfully demonstrated not during easy periods but under pressure. A teenager who sat in a room with law enforcement asking pointed questions and said nothing had demonstrated something that many grown men in this business could not reliably demonstrate. From that point forward, Hill's position within the organization had a different quality. He was no longer simply an errand boy who had proven himself useful. He was a person the crew had a stake in developing. The arrest produced no conviction, because the boy who had been watching from the window had already decided, with a certainty that would govern the next 25 years, that there was only one way you handled a situation like this, and you did not talk to prosecutors. The education continued through the rest of his teenage years, conducted not in any classroom but in the specific curriculum of Vario's crew. Hill absorbed the operational knowledge the way a gifted student absorbs a language, not by studying it formally, but by constant immersion in its actual use. He understood how hijacking operations worked, how trucks were selected, and when they were taken, and where the loads were moved afterward. He understood the tribute system that governed how earnings were shared within the crew and between crews, and the specific deference required when dealing with representatives of other families who considered particular pieces of territory their own. He understood, above everything else, the internal hierarchy: who gave orders, who carried them out, who could not be touched, and who could be touched only with explicit authorization from the appropriate level of the family's leadership. The one rule he could not change was the one built into him by birth. His father was Irish. His mother was Sicilian. In the world of the American Mafia, as it operated in the 1950s and 1960s, the blood requirement for full membership was absolute. A made man, a formally inducted member of a recognized crime family, had to be of full Italian descent. Half Italian was insufficient. Irish ancestry on one side meant permanent exclusion from the category that provided the organization's fullest internal protection. This limitation carried real operational consequences. An associate could be killed by his own organization without the formal approval process that governed what happened when a made man was eliminated. An associate's position in disputes carried less institutional weight. Hill would spend 25 years building relationships and earning at a level that made him indispensable, and he would never be able to convert that indispensability into the one status that the organization's rules reserved for men whose blood was different from his. In June of 1960, at 17 years old, Hill joined the United States Army and was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. What precisely motivated this decision is not established clearly in the record. The Army represented the most obvious legitimate path available to a young man from his background, and Hill took it. He served until approximately 1963. The Army years were consequential primarily in what they did not produce. They did not alter his fundamental orientation. They did not provide a professional skill that would anchor him in the legitimate economy after his discharge. They did not produce relationships or opportunities that pointed away from the Vario crew. When his service ended and he returned to Brooklyn, the cab stand was still there, the men were still there, and the life he had been building in the gaps between his commitments was still waiting for him. The Army had given him 3 years of something else. When his discharge came, he returned to Brooklyn, and everything was exactly as he had left it, except that now there was James Burke. James Burke had been working in and around the Vario crew since the middle of the 1950s, and by the time Hill returned from Fort Bragg, Burke had become the most productive earner the crew possessed. He was Irish-American, born on July 5, 1931, and therefore, like Hill, permanently ineligible for maid membership regardless of how much he produced or how completely he demonstrated his value. Unlike Hill, he had been in the life long enough to have converted this limitation into something that functioned more like a competitive advantage than a structural disadvantage. Because the formal hierarchy would never fully protect him, he made himself too valuable to harm. Burke's nickname was Jimmy the Gent, a name that originated in his habit of tipping extravagantly whenever money was available. It was a reputation constructed deliberately, the kind of visible generosity that built loyalty in the specific currency of the criminal world, which was personal obligation. Men who had received money from Burke when they needed it felt something toward him that was more durable than the formal obligations that organizational membership created, because personal generosity, unlike organizational structure, could not be formally revoked by anyone above either party in the hierarchy. Hill's relationship with Burke developed after his Army return with a speed that the preceding years had prepared for. They were alike in the specific ways that mattered within the organization. Both were Irish, both were permanently outside the made man structure, and both were willing to earn at levels that compensated organizationally for the status they could not achieve formally. The shared limitation produced not resentment between them, but a specific kind of mutual recognition. Two men in the same structural position understood each other's vulnerabilities and each other's reasons for the choices those vulnerabilities required. The third figure in the crew's inner circle was Thomas DeSimone. DeSimone was, by every account in the historical record, a man whose willingness to use violence consistently preceded any consideration of what consequences that violence might produce. He had come into the Vario orbit through the same geography of Brooklyn that had shaped the others. What distinguished him from Burke and Hill was not organizational sophistication, but a specific quality of violence that the organization found useful in controlled applications and dangerous in uncontrolled ones. He was not sent on delicate assignments requiring restraint. He was sent when you wanted the other party to understand that non-compliance had been permanently removed from the available options. Burke managed this quality with the authority their operational relationship had established over years of shared work. Hill existed alongside it with the pragmatism of someone who understood that DeSimone's presence solved problems that no other instrument could solve. Together, the three of them operated as a unit that Vario deployed toward whatever opportunity the airport and the surrounding territory presented. Three men ran the most productive corner of the Vario crew through the mid-1960s, and not one of them could be inducted as a made member. What they could do was earn, and earn at a scale the organization had not seen before from this particular corner of Brooklyn. The clearest demonstration of what the crew had built at Kennedy Airport came on the evening of April 7th, 1967. The Air France cargo terminal processed American currency that had been exchanged overseas by tourists and military personnel and was being returned to American banks for deposit. The money traveled as cargo, stored in a secure room at the terminal until Brink's trucks arrived the following business day. The security architecture protecting it reflected an era before the protocols that would later make such operations considerably more difficult. One room, one key, one guard whose attention could be managed with patience and planning. The operation Hill and DeSimone executed was a function of inside knowledge, obtained through a method with nothing spectacular about it. A contact at the terminal had developed a relationship with the guard who carried the key. Through a series of meetings at a motel near the airport, the key was removed from the guard's pants pocket, copied, and returned without the guard's awareness of what had happened. When the currency shipment arrived, Hill and DeSimone drove to the terminal after midnight with the largest empty suitcase Hill could find, walked through the cargo area using the duplicate key to open the storage room, loaded 7 bags of American currency into the suitcase, and walked out. No alarm was raised. No shots were fired. No one was present who required any form of coercion. They left with $420,000. This figure represented, at that moment, the largest cash theft that had been executed at the airport. Hill would later describe the Air France job as the event that permanently established his position within the organization, and the assessment was accurate in the specific way that significant criminal achievements establish reputations, not through announcement, but through the amount of money that moved through the tribute system and the identity of the people who had produced it. Of the $420,000, $120,000 was paid upward. The relevant portion went to Vario as the supervising capo. A separate amount went to the Colombo family captain who held territorial claim over that portion of the airport and had to be compensated for any operation conducted there without his prior involvement. The $300,000 that remained was divided among the participants who had done the actual work. What Hill received from the Air France operation was more than his share of the proceeds. It was the specific kind of credibility that came from having produced something at a scale the crew had not previously seen from a single operation. Vario's investment in Hill across the previous 13 years had returned something significant. The relationship between the two men, which had always been structural in the patron and associate sense, acquired an additional quality that would define how Vario treated Hill for the following decade. Hill used his share to purchase a restaurant on Queens Boulevard, which he called the Suite. He intended to operate it as a legitimate business, and for several months he tried. Then the organization moved into the room, the way it always did, and the distinction between the legitimate and the criminal ceased to be one worth maintaining. Members of the Lucchese and Gambino crews moved through the restaurant as a matter of course. The Suite became a mob hangout, indistinguishable from any other establishment the organization used for gathering and business and the maintenance of the social infrastructure that held it together. The attempt to use the proceeds of the life for something outside the life had lasted a few months and produced exactly what every similar attempt in this world produced. The prosperity of the late 1960s had given the crew a confidence that occasionally outran the rules governing what the organization permitted, and nowhere was this more visible than in the relationship between Thomas DeSimone and a Gambino family soldier named William Bentvena. Bentvena was known by the nickname Billy Bats. He had been a Gambino-made man before his arrest and imprisonment on charges that had kept him incarcerated through most of the late 1960s. In 1970, he was released and a party was held in his honor at a bar called Robert's Lounge, owned by Burke and used regularly by the crew. Bentvena had a manner toward the men around him that could be read, depending on circumstances and the person receiving it, as either casual authority or condescension. On this particular evening, the reading was determined by who he was speaking to. He spoke to Thomas DeSimone in a way that DeSimone experienced as an insult. The specific content of the exchange involved a reference to a period in DeSimone's earlier life when he had worked shining shoes, delivered with the tone of a man reminding someone else of where they had come from. Whether Bentvena intended what DeSimone received is a question the historical record cannot answer. What the record shows is the result. The party continued, and Bentvena was still at the bar when DeSimone and Burke began beating him. The beating was severe enough that the men present eventually placed Bentvena in the trunk of a car and drove him toward a location where he could be disposed of properly. Some distance into the drive, movement came from the trunk. They stopped. Bentvena was still alive. He was beaten again with a shovel and a tire iron until he was not. The body was buried near a kennel owned by an associate upstate, then moved and disposed of several months later by Hill and DeSimone when word reached them that investigators might search the area near the initial burial site. The killing carried a specific organizational complication that was immediately apparent to everyone involved. Billy Batts was a made man in the Gambino family. Killing a made man without commission approval was precisely the kind of act the organizational rules existed to prevent, because it created an interfamily debt that could not be resolved informally and that the creditor family would collect at the time and in the manner of their choosing. The Gambino family knew what had happened. It would not respond immediately. It would respond eventually, and in the meantime, everyone who had been present in that bar would carry the weight of that knowledge in everything they did afterward. The Gambino family knew what had happened. It had always known what had happened. The accounting for William Benvena's life had been entered in a ledger the Gambino family maintained with methodical patience, and the balance would not be settled for 9 more years. 2 years after the Benvena murder, the specific variety of enforcement work Hill had been conducting for the organization produced a federal charge that placed him in a courtroom under considerably less favorable circumstances than his first arrest at 16. The charge arose from an incident involving a man who had declined to pay a gambling debt. The enforcement action taken against this man was standard for the kind of work the crew did, but it carried an administrative complication that transformed its jurisdiction. The man had a sister employed by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. This connection converted what would otherwise have been a local matter with local consequences into a federal charge with federal sentencing guidelines. Hill was convicted of extortion in 1972 and sentenced to 10 years. He served 4. Federal prisons concentrate in a single physical space. The most experienced, most connected, and most resourceful criminal practitioners from across multiple operations and multiple organizations. The contacts Hill made during those 4 years would serve him in the period that followed, though not in the direction Paul Vario would have chosen. He came out of federal custody in the mid-1970s, carrying a set of narcotics connections that his existing criminal infrastructure was positioned to exploit immediately. Cocaine was moving through New York and Pittsburgh and several other cities in volumes that made the narcotics trade one of the most lucrative criminal enterprises available to anyone with the supply relationships and the distribution network to access it. Hill had developed both during his 4 years inside. The operation he built ran Brooklyn-produced cocaine to Pittsburgh through a network of contacts that extended beyond the Lucchese family's immediate geographic territory. Paul Vario had a rule about narcotics. The rule was operational rather than moral. The federal penalties for narcotics trafficking were catastrophically severe relative to the penalties governing the operations the crew traditionally ran and the exposure that came with a drug operation, the broader circle of participants who had to know about it, the financial trails that were harder to conceal than the proceeds of hijacking or gambling, made narcotics a risk Vario calculated was not worth the return. He made the prohibition explicit with the people in his crew. No drugs. The instruction was not optional, and the consequences of disregarding it were not ambiguous. Hill disregarded it. The cocaine network he built generated income at a scale that exceeded what the traditional crew work produced. It also generated the kind of operational visibility that narcotics dealing always generates. More participants, more transactions, more exposure. Hill's own addiction to the drug he was selling added a layer of personal instability to an operation that required careful management. Vario learned eventually what Hill was doing, through the same network of human intelligence that governed the organization's awareness of everything happening within its territory. His response was to withdraw the protection and patronage and organizational standing that had made Hill's career possible since he was 11 years old. What Vario could not do was undo the fact that Hill was still alive, still running his operation, and still present at every significant event in the crew's history, including the one that was about to define the rest of their lives. Paul Vario had withdrawn his protection, which meant that Henry Hill was still alive and still connected to everything the crew had done, but without the institutional foundation beneath him that had always made that presence safe. By the autumn of 1978, the crew was running an operation inside college basketball while simultaneously planning the robbery that would define all of their careers. The Boston College basketball program was competing in the 1978 to 79 season, and through contacts Hill had developed, certain players on the team were being paid to control the point spread without necessarily losing games. The scheme required that participants consistently produce results within specific numerical ranges, a form of performance management that demanded discretion from the players and precise organizational coordination from the people running the betting side. Hill organized the scheme's operational structure. Burke was connected to the broader betting infrastructure. The returns the arrangement generated were fed into the markets in a way that produced profit without attracting the pattern of unusual activity that would have triggered regulatory attention. The scheme ran across the season without disruption. Its eventual exposure would come not through any failure in the scheme itself, but through the investigative attention that descended on the crew in the aftermath of something substantially larger. Because what was also being planned in the autumn of 1978 was the operation that would dwarf everything the crew had previously done at the airport. The information about the Lufthansa shipment reached Burke through Louis Werner, a cargo employee at Kennedy Airport, whose accumulated gambling debts had made him receptive to an arrangement with people who could address them. Werner had access to the specific logistics of the Lufthansa cargo operation. When large currency shipments arrived, where they were stored, which employees would be present on the relevant night, and how the terminal's security could be navigated by people who understood its layout. The currency was the same category of asset that Air France had moved 11 years earlier, American money exchanged overseas, returning to American banks. The volume was substantially larger. Burke assembled a team with the organizational care he brought to everything he planned. A stolen black Ford Econoline van would carry the six-man crew. Bolt cutters would handle the perimeter gate. At 3 in the morning on December 11th, 1978, the van pulled up to Building 261 on the grounds of Kennedy Airport. The crew cut the padlock at the gate, entered the cargo terminal, and located the employees on duty. 10 workers were bound and confined to the cafeteria, plastic tape across their mouths. One guard was struck across the face with the barrel of a .45 caliber automatic and instructed to disable the alarm system near the loading dock. He complied. The vault was opened. The money was loaded. The entire operation, from entry to departure, took approximately 90 minutes. The take was $5 million in unmarked cash and $875,000 in jewelry, for a combined total of $5,875,000. It was the largest cash robbery committed in the United States to that point in history. The crew had estimated perhaps $2 million in advance. What they found in the Lufthansa vault was nearly 3 times that figure. The van was driven from the airport. The money was transferred to other vehicles. Parnell Edwards, whose assignment was to take the van to a junkyard in New Jersey and have it compacted, drove it instead to a street in Brooklyn and left it there. 2 days later, investigators found the van on that street. Inside were fingerprints that connected Edwards to the crew. It was the first physical evidence investigators had in the case. Parnell Edwards had been told to take the van to a junkyard and have it compacted. He left it on a Brooklyn street instead, and Burke, who had spent decades understanding that loose ends were the one category of problem no amount of organizational efficiency could survive, began making calls. What followed the Lufthansa robbery was not a celebration. Parnell Edwards was the first participant killed. His failure with the van had produced the first physical evidence connecting anyone to the robbery, and in Burke's operational calculus, a failure of that magnitude required the same response as every other failure that created exposure for the organization. Martin Krugman, the bookmaker who had served as the liaison between Werner's inside knowledge and Burke's crew, disappeared on January 6, 1979. His body was never found. Thomas DeSimone disappeared on January 14, 1979. His disappearance differed from the others in its organizational source. DeSimone had not failed in an assignment. He had not made the operational error that Edwards had made. What he had done 9 years earlier was kill a Gambino made man without authorization, and the Gambino family had maintained the patience required to collect that debt at the moment of their choosing. Desdemone was led to believe he was being inducted as a made man in the Lucchese family, an honor that would have elevated his standing significantly. The induction ceremony was the occasion for the settlement. Hill later stated that Desdemone was killed by the Gambino family in retaliation for the Bentvena murder. Exactly how Desdemone died is not established in the documentary record. What is established is that he was never seen again. The deaths continued into the spring and summer of 1979. Robert McMahon and Joseph Manree, cargo workers who had participated in the operation and who declined FBI offers of witness protection, were found in May, shot in the back of the head, sitting together in a parked car. The following month, Paolo Licastri, a Sicilian drug trafficker who had represented the Gambino family's interest in the heist, was found burned, shot, and unclothed on a garbage heap in Brooklyn. Richard Eaton, who had been involved in laundering the heist proceeds through businesses in Florida and who was suspected of having skimmed from the money he handled, was found frozen inside a refrigerated meat truck. Children made that discovery. By the summer of 1979, approximately 8 men connected to the Lufthansa operation were dead or missing. Federal investigators worked the case from the night of the robbery. Louis Werner, the Lufthansa employee whose inside knowledge had made the operation possible, was arrested in 1979, eventually convicted and imprisoned. He was the only person ever formally convicted in connection with the Lufthansa heist. Burke himself was never charged for the robbery. The men who could have connected him to it were either dead, missing, or bound by the same organizational discipline that had governed the crew's operations for decades. The FBI understood who was responsible. The distance between understanding and proof, in the absence of living cooperative witnesses, was a distance Burke had engineered over decades of practice. He had constructed a situation in which the robbery that made him one of the most successful thieves in American criminal history was also the crime for which he could never be prosecuted. The man who had designed the robbery had also designed what came after it, and both designs worked with the precision he intended. What he had not designed for was Henry Hill, who had by this point developed a problem that was going to bring everything down. Henry Hill had been building his narcotics operation using the prison contacts he had developed during his 4 years in federal custody, and by the spring of 1980, it was generating income at a scale that exceeded what the traditional crew work produced, and exposure at a scale that exceeded what any cautious observer of his situation would have tolerated. Vario had already withdrawn his protection. The organizational structure beneath Hill's operations was already gone. What remained was the operation itself, the addiction that had made the operation feel necessary, and an increasing number of federal agents who had been watching the Brooklyn to Pittsburgh cocaine network long enough to move against it. On April the 27th, 1980, federal agents arrested Hill in Nassau County on narcotics trafficking charges. The FBI played him the wire recording. It documented a conversation between Burke and Vario in which Burke was explicit that Hill needed to be killed. The recording had been captured by a listening device the two men had not known was present. It was not a threat communicated through organizational channels. It was a private conversation between the two people who had been the central relationships of Hill's adult life, conducted in the belief that they were not being observed, confirming that his continued existence represented more organizational risk than his death would create. Within days, he was out on bail. Burke called him. The manner was warm and familiar, the way Burke always was when he was managing a situation through personal interaction rather than organizational mechanism. He proposed a trip to Florida, a specific job, work for which Hill's capabilities would be useful. Hill had never been asked to participate in a killing for the organization before. He understood what it meant when the first such request came in the days immediately following his arrest and the revelation of a recorded conversation about his murder. He did not travel to Florida. Federal agents intercepted the plan and returned Hill to custody. Prosecutors offered the arrangement the government offered to anyone who possessed what Hill possessed. information sufficient to substantially dismantle a significant portion of one of the five families' operations in exchange for cooperation, protection, and resolution of the charges against him. The government was offering the one thing the organization had made clear it could no longer provide, which was the continued fact of his survival, and Henry Hill accepted the offer with the same speed and the same absence of sentiment that had governed every calculation he had made since he was 11 years old. On May 27th, 1980, the agreement was signed. What he carried into that agreement, beyond the name and the face that government documents could not change, was 25 years of operational knowledge. The specific crimes, the conversations, the financial arrangements, the orders, and the organizational structure of the Vario crew and its connections to the broader Lucchese operation. He was not a peripheral figure whose testimony would have produced peripheral results. He was closer to the center of the crew's operations than anyone who was not Vario or Burke himself. Karen and their two children, Greg and Gina, were moved with him. New York, the organization, and the life that had been his entire adult identity were left behind. What remained of that identity he carried inside him, which would prove more durable than any of the institutional protections the government was about to arrange. The testimony Henry Hill provided to federal prosecutors was not the testimony of a man with a troubled conscience about what he had done. It was the testimony of a man who understood exactly what he had to offer and offered all of it, because all of it was the price of the deal he had accepted. He provided the history of the crew's operations with the specificity of someone who had been present at the relevant events rather than reconstructing them from any other source. He provided documentation of Vario's role in specific crimes and of the organizational structure through which those crimes had been managed. He provided what the prosecutors needed to connect Burke to the Boston College point shaving operation and to the murder of Richard Eaton. He provided whatever was needed because the calculus he had accepted required it. The prosecutorial consequences accumulated across the following years. Vario was convicted in 1984 of fraud, specifically having helped Hill obtain a no-show job that served as the basis for Hill's parole from a prior prison sentence. The charge produced a 4-year term. In 1985, a conviction for extortion of air freight companies at Kennedy Airport, based directly on the operations Hill had been so central to for so many years, added 10 years. Vario, born in 1914 and by this point in his early 70s, did not survive his sentence. He died of respiratory failure on May 3, 1988, at the Federal Correctional Institution in Fort Worth, Texas. He was 73 years old. He had never been convicted of any charge directly connected to the Lufthansa robbery. Burke's prosecutorial fate followed a different path to the same destination. In 1982, he was convicted on conspiracy charges arising from the Boston College point shaving operation and sentenced to 12 years. While serving that sentence, he was convicted of the murder of Richard Eaton and sentenced to 20 years to life. Burke died of cancer at the Roswell Park Cancer Institute in Buffalo, New York on April 13, 1996. He was 64 years old, 12 years from parole eligibility on the murder conviction alone, and he was never charged with the Lufthansa robbery itself, the crime for which he was most responsible and which had generated more money than anything else he had organized in his life. The specific irony that every significant figure in the story recognized was this: Vario, who had spent decades building a crew whose survival depended on everyone within it, refusing to talk to law enforcement, had been brought down by the one person who had the most comprehensive knowledge of what the crew had done and the most pressing personal reason to use it. The man who had celebrated Henry Hill's first act of criminal loyalty at 16, the refusal to cooperate with prosecutors, was destroyed by the same man's decision to cooperate with prosecutors at 36. It was the same calculation in reverse. The two men whose careers had defined 25 years of Hill's adult life died in federal custody within 8 years of each other, and Hill had long since been living under names the government had assigned him, demonstrating the same thing to the Marshal Service that he had already demonstrated to Vario, that some things about a person do not change, regardless of what the institution around them requires. The Federal Witness Security Program was designed around an assumption that the evidence in Henry Hill's case quickly began to challenge. The assumption was that a person motivated by fear of the organization they had left would maintain the low profile that protection required. Hill shared that fear. What the program had not fully accounted for was that fear alone is insufficient to produce a fundamental change in how a person operates, and Hill had spent 37 years developing an operational style and a set of social habits that did not transform when his name did. He was assigned the alias Martin Lewis, reportedly named after two entertainers whose combined identities suggested something about the degree of institutional humor the Marshal Service permitted itself. The family was relocated from New York to the first of what would eventually become approximately 10 different locations across the country. Omaha, Nebraska was among the early relocations. Independence, Kentucky followed. Redmond, Washington, in the Seattle metropolitan area, would be the location where the program's relationship with Hill reached its final point. Each relocation followed a pattern that the program had developed through its experience with the fundamental tension at the heart of witness protection, that the people it shelters are typically the people whose instincts, habits, and social networks are the precise things that make them discoverable. A person who avoided the behaviors of their former life and adopted a new identity thoroughly enough to become genuinely difficult to locate was the person the program was designed for. Hill was not that person. The drug use that had precipitated his arrest continued in the relocation cities. The social behaviors that had characterized his engagement with the people around him throughout his adult life continued in environments where those behaviors were incompatible with the low-profile existence the program required. The criminal opportunities that presented themselves to a man with his skills and contacts were not unavailable simply because he was operating under a name produced in Washington rather than Brooklyn. The combination of these factors produced what the program's administrators eventually had to acknowledge as the specific problem they had agreed to manage when they accepted Henry Hill as a participant. Nicholas Pileggi had been reporting on organized crime in New York for years when the opportunity to document Hill's account presented itself. The interviews Pileggi conducted with Hill, the first extended record of Hill's own narration of his career, from inside the perspective of someone who had been at its center, produced a book published in 1985. The title was Wise Guy: Life in a Mafia Family. Its publication, while Hill was still nominally inside the program, illustrated something the program administrators could not ignore: that Hill was constitutionally incapable of the disappearance the program required. A man who had built his entire identity around a criminal career and the organizational membership that career produced did not adapt naturally to a life in which that identity had to be permanently concealed. In 1987, in or around Redmond, Washington, Hill was arrested on cocaine trafficking charges. This was not the first incident that had strained the program's relationship with him, but it was the one that ended it. He was removed from the Federal Witness Security Program in 1987, 7 years after his entry, having relocated approximately 10 times and having accumulated a record within the program that documented the specific limitation of what institutional protection can accomplish when the person being protected is committed to remaining himself. The separation from Karen began in 1989. Their divorce was not formally finalized until 2002, a timeline that reflected the particular quality of the arrangements that organized crime makes with everyone it touches. They are difficult to end, even when everyone involved understands they are over. He was out of the program, out of his marriage, and for the first time in his adult life, entirely on his own, which meant that the skills he had developed over the previous 35 years were pointing in the same directions they had always pointed, just without anyone above him in the hierarchy to disapprove. 3 years before the film that would make Hill famous was released, the book that made the film possible appeared, Wise Guy: Life in a Mafia Family, written by Nicholas Pileggi, provided the documented account that Pileggi had assembled through his extensive interviews with Hill and through research into the court records and investigative files surrounding the Vario crew's operations. The book was received as journalism of a specific and significant kind, a deeply sourced account of how organized crime functioned at the level of daily operations, narrated from inside the perspective of someone who had spent 25 years at the center of that function. Martin Scorsese read the book. Scorsese's adaptation, developed with Pileggi as co-screenwriter, was released in 1990 under the title Goodfellas. Ray Liotta played Henry Hill. Robert De Niro played Jimmy Conway, the character derived from James Burke. Joe Pesci played Tommy DeVito, the character derived from Thomas DeSimone, and won the Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor for the performance. Paul Sorvino played Paul Cicero, the character derived from Paul Vario. Lorraine Bracco played Karen Hill. The film received 6 Academy Award nominations and entered the cultural record as one of the most celebrated American crime films produced in the 20th century. The film transformed Hill's status in ways that no other development in his life had managed to produce. He had been, for the decade before the film's release, a man who had cooperated with federal prosecutors, been expelled from witness protection for cocaine trafficking, and was living somewhere in the country under conditions he was repeatedly violating. The film made him something else, a character in a celebrated piece of American cinema, with a major actor's face attached to his story and a major director's filmmaking attached to his world. The man who had been removed from the program the government built to make him disappear had become one of the more recognizable faces in American popular culture. Hill embraced this status with the same adaptive intelligence he had applied to every previous situation. He gave interviews. He appeared on radio programs, including repeated appearances on the Howard Stern program, where he eventually revealed that he had killed 3 people during his years with the organization, on direct orders from Vario, having previously denied any personal involvement in violence. He used his identity as the real subject behind a famous film to generate income and attention that the operations he had previously run were no longer available to produce. The specific skill that had always characterized him, the ability to read what a room required and provide it, found new applications in environments his criminal career had never anticipated. The Wise Guy Cookbook appeared in 2002, connecting the cooking skills he had developed during the witness protection years, when he had worked as a chef at an Italian restaurant in North Platte, Nebraska, to the public identity the Scorsese film had created. It was the particular kind of enterprise that characterized his post-criminal years, the conversion of his criminal history into commercial product, the life that had destroyed careers and caused deaths, becoming the material for a cooking show format. In 2005, he was arrested for attempted possession of methamphetamine and pleaded no contest to the charge, receiving a sentence of 180 days. Separately that same year, he threatened his second wife and another person with a knife, producing its own legal proceedings. In 2006, Ray Liotta encountered Hill during a joint appearance for a magazine photo portfolio and urged him to enter rehabilitation. Hill later told a reporter in 2009 that he had used every drug available to him and could not manage his relationship with alcohol. He had married Kelly Allor in 1990 and divorced her in 1996. He became engaged to a woman named Lisa Caserta in 2006 and remained engaged to her for the rest of his life. He died on June 12, 2012, in Los Angeles, one day after his 69th birthday, from complications from heart disease, which was not the death that anyone who had known him in Brooklyn had ever predicted, including Henry Hill himself, the organized crime associates whose careers he had dismantled, the family members who by every applicable organizational rule should have arranged his murder within months of his testimony, had never acted against him. He died not from violence, but from the accumulated physical consequences of decades of substance use and the ordinary deterioration that heart disease produces. His fiancée described it as a peaceful end. It was an assessment that applied equally to the manner of his dying and to the general anticlimax of everything that followed his testimony. A man who had committed crimes at the scale of the Lufthansa heist, who had testified against the most powerful criminal organization in New York City, who had been relocated 10 times under false names and arrested repeatedly despite those names, died in a Los Angeles hospital from heart failure, ordinary and inevitable, the way most people die. The record he left behind, stripped of the mythology the film created and the self serving narrative he provided across his final 2 decades, is a story about the specific mechanism through which organized crime recruits and retains people. It does not recruit through ideology or explicit coercion. It recruits through the simple demonstration of what the life offers to people for whom the legitimate alternative offers very little. A cab stand across the street from a working class household in Brooklyn in the 1950s was a continuous and visible demonstration of an alternative economy, observable every morning from a bedroom window. The 11-year-old who crossed the street was making a rational calculation within the terms that his world presented to him. The calculation's terms changed in April of 1980, and Hill recalculated with the same speed and the same clarity that had characterized every previous calculation. This is what the organization's discipline had never fully accounted for: that the loyalty it enforced through consequences was no more durable than the consequences themselves. When the consequences shifted, the loyalty shifted with them. Every man in that organization operated by the same logic. The difference was only that most of them were not, at the moment the consequences shifted, in a position to offer what Hill was positioned to offer. What he left behind was an organization substantially dismantled, a film substantially more celebrated than the life it documented, and a record in the federal witness security program that serves as a precise demonstration of the specific population for whom that program's assumptions do not hold. The program was designed to protect people who wanted to disappear. Hill did not want to disappear. He wanted to remain exactly who he was, under whatever name the government assigned him. He succeeded in that ambition at the cost of every other one.